And how about you introduce yourself a little bit? Tell us a little bit more about how long you've been working here and what it is that you do, your title here at the Academy of Sciences.
I study the invisible. For most of you, it's
Thank
invisible.
you.
I study the ants that maybe you never see because you're too tall. That's why I'm glad to see some kids here, because you need to be just above the surface to start seeing that. But actually, ants are what we need to see, because ants are like other things we need to see. We need to see sustainability. We need to see these things that we never see. So my job is to give you new green glasses to start seeing the world differently. See the ants, but also see why sustainability is important, your role in sustainability. You know, when we see a forest, all you see is the big green trees. You don't see the little things. Behind the scenes, we call that the brown cycle. The brown cycle is involved with turning over nutrients back into building blocks to make things. Like when you see San Francisco, you just see the big tall buildings. You don't see maybe a woman making tortillas in the Mission. You have to see it all, or else it's not a city, it's not an ecosystem. So my job is to understand those building blocks called ants that make ecosystems work. And believe me, we need ecosystems that work, because that's, I think, our newest revelation, that to make society continue the way we like society, we have to figure out how we impact the world around us, and that's critical.
Wow. So going and seeing really the building blocks of our ecology and all those things that really make the world go round. So you have been all over the world. You've devoted your life to looking for these ants. Ants in particular, you said, are very, very important. What first got you to learn about ants? What was the first moment that you discovered that ants were the thing that you really wanted to study?
Well, like you, I grew up not really seeing ants in their entirety. I thought there were maybe one or two species. And then I was lucky that I went to the tropics. And as a sophomore in college, I went to Panama. I was going to be a botanist. And I went out in the forest, and every leaf I looked at, every plant I saw, every square meter of earth, there was an ant. And I asked people, hey, look at these ants. Who's studying ants? They said, oh, nobody. Maybe one or two people. I'm like, what do you mean? We can't even identify these ants to genus, or nobody's studying them? We don't have a list? There isn't even a book on the ants of North America. Well, until I wrote one a few years ago.
Nice.
But that was surprised. How in the world that's something that could be so abundant? You know, if you put all ants together, they weigh about as much as all humans. You could remove birds from a rainforest and still have a rainforest, but you couldn't remove the ants. So these important ecological machines, we knew nothing about. And to me, so I switched from plants. Actually, I just got rid of the P and the L and started studying ants. And I was hooked ever since.
And you have been traveling all over the world. You've been to China, you've been to Saudi Arabia. One of the places that you've really spent a lot of time, or maybe more recently, is Madagascar. And they've taken you through some really interesting adventures. Can you tell us a little bit about what it's like to be out in the field, what it takes to set that up?
Well, it's easy to plan a trip when you're in your office.
Okay.
And this last trip was exactly that. I was going to go to this beautiful remote forest. It sounded so simple. I was going to drive for a day and a half and get on a boat and float down the river, and I'd be there. Well, 2 days after leaving the capital, a cyclone struck. I spent the next 12 days digging out of a cyclone, and that was quite difficult. And you can read about it in the New York Times this week. And I think the thing to me is that you have very few, oh my God, this is a pristine forest moment. But I've had those, and that to me is some of the most cherished times of my life, when I've actually gone to a beautiful forest before it's been cut down, gotten there and seen the majestic nature at its best. Now, that's the emotional side of being a scientist, and also going there and discovering those things, and that's firsthand, seeing it right in my face, this new species. That's an excitement. But at the same time, it's more than that. It's actually discovering something that we can hope we can turn around and use to better preserve what's out there. And that's really the fundamental long-term goal. It's not just to describe a new species, but to bring that species to the attention of the world, to connect you to it and make you realize that you can't just preserve a tree, a lemur. You need to preserve how a forest works together. And that requires a lot of baseline groundwork. The heart of our institution here is to go out and understand the building blocks of nature. We're benefiting from healthy ecosystems, but we can't just look at ecosystems as a whole. We need to also understand their building blocks, and that's the role of this great institution here, is to help us understand what's out there, put a name to it, so we can start studying it and understanding our impact on it and how they work together, how they create this wonderful world we live in.
Wow. So one of those places that you really traveled a lot to, and I mentioned earlier, Madagascar. What is so amazing about Madagascar that brings you to that place to do your research?
Well, it's far away, and there's nothing more exotic than going far away. In fact, if you dug a hole straight down here, what's the landmass you would arrive closest to? It'd be Madagascar. So I worked the furthest possible place away. So I suffer from jet lag a lot. And Madagascar is next to Africa, but it was attached to Africa a long time ago.
Go back.
About 120 million years ago, it was attached, and it broke away with India. Then India broke away from Madagascar, moved north, dropped to Seychelles, hit Asia, formed the Himalayas. Madagascar has been its own evolutionary island story for a long time. In fact, all 106 primates are only found in Madagascar, the lemurs. Most of the ants, 99%, the frogs, the snakes, it's its own world. And it allows us to scale down the world into a more manageable place to study how ecosystems and speciation occur. It allows us to understand the past and also help us predict the future. We can do that on a small scale. In fact, if we can't do it for Madagascar, there's no hope we'll have for doing it across the world, and we're doing our best to understand it in Madagascar. But in addition, Madagascar is one of the hot spots, that means the special places, that are under increasing threat. There's only about 10% of the animals and plants left in Madagascar in terms of the forest. So our research has a chance of helping preserve those remaining patches.
And you can see a little bit of that research. If you look to your side over here, we do have a couple of examples of some things that were found, some animals that you would find in Madagascar. And I believe that maybe your face can be found somewhere, possibly in this video over here.
A few places, yes.
So a few places in the museum for sure. Now, when you're out there and you're in the field, what are the roles of some of the people that you meet there? Do you work a lot with the people who live there locally?
There's kind of two ways to be a scientist, a collector. One is to travel the whole world, going to a new place every day. It's really fun. But for Madagascar, I decided to invest long term. So we developed a biodiversity center, which is a training center there. You can see pictures of it at the end of this exhibit. Mm-hmm. And there, it's given us a base to actually create a core of scientists in Madagascar to help us and to adopt our missions and to absorb our mission and help us green Madagascar. And those are the students that we teach through classes at the university or bringing them into the field. We have a core group that have worked with us all over, and it's a wonderful team, a passionate team, and it's through them our project can live on and continue. Now, we've been there 20 years already, and we plan to be there in the future, but it really takes that amount of effort to make a change. And it's been exciting to work with them and do stuff that you can't even believe in the morning you were going to do, like go on a hot air balloon or go down a river or pull your vehicle across a river where it's deeper than the windshield. And that's been really exciting.
Yeah, no kidding. So I do see some really interesting ways of you getting around. What are some of the most exciting modes of transportation that you use to get around these really remote places?
Well, it all begins with a drive. You know, that drive could end at a village or a river or a broken bridge. Then after that, you have to seek other transportation. The next best 4x4, actually the best 4x4 is a ox cart. We've taken those. And then you take that as far as you can, and then you walk. And you walk and you walk. And usually, to get to these remote forests, they're remote because if there's people living next door, there's no forest. They're remote, and you go there, and you set up. And 50-kilometer hike is very normal now. But we've been lucky that we've teamed up with some film companies where we've gotten access to helicopters, and believe me, that changes everything. I wish I had a helicopter for every trip in Madagascar. And sometimes we teamed up with a French group that gave us tools to access the canopy. The canopy is the tops of the trees. It's really kind of close, maybe only 100 meters, but how do you get up there? And they've organized these hot air balloons, and they drop this structure on top of it, which is like a carnival balloon with pantyhose in between. They drop it on the canopy, and then they drop you on there, and you live in these tents, and you live on the canopy for maybe a week at a time, and you throw a rope down and bring up food, and there you live in the canopy. And you can have access to the animals and plants in the canopy. It's a different world. So as a human, you're kind of small and you're limited. And the trick has been to figure out how to get to places where there are life. Our greatest frontier now is accessing the soil. We think of it as hard, but it's actually a mosaic with cavities and air pockets where all these interesting things live. And this is where we're finding the most exciting things. Very old lineages have survived great earthquakes and fires and volcanoes above because they live underground. So these great events that have caused extinctions, like to dinosaurs and other organisms, have left those that live underground to persist. And it's like a time capsule to be able to go back and see the DNA of these things. Has been very exciting.
Now, it seems like there would be a lot of spaces to go and look. How do you know where to look? And once you've found those places, how do you collect the things that you're collecting?
Well, when we arrive at a forest, after our drive, our hike, our sweat, and our hunger, we get there, and we go through these standard kind of mass collecting techniques. These are like machines. We have these traps that look like a tent that collect flying insects. We have this other sifting device that we sift for a day and take all the leaf litter and put them in this trap that extracts the insects that come out of this extractor. We dig in the soil. We set up lights. We set up baits for butterflies to come to. We set up pitfall traps. Those are all the things that work while we're sleeping at night, so we love them. And then we just go on the hunt. And that's when we dig into rotten logs. We look in broken twigs. We go up into the canopy, and we look. And that's where the fun begins, because you actually get to see the animal live in its place and learn something about its biology at that time. So we're not only just trying to get as many species as possible, we're trying to actually understand them by studying their reproductive biology and their behavior to better understand why they're living here and not somewhere else.
Now, you found some really interesting specimens, which you bring back here to the lab to process and to figure out what if it's a new species or what kind it is. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you do that?
Well, our best studies are done with live material. So we bring back live colonies. For example, this ant was a great mystery. Why does it do with its long mandibles? How does it live? And why are there two kinds in the nest? There's a red one and a black one. So we brought a colony back and studied its biology. As it turns out, unlike other ants, the small red ones are the queens. And there's not one of them like in most ants. It's equal 50-50, 50% queens, 50% workers, and the workers are larger. And what do they do with these large mandibles? Well, they tackle large centipedes, and they eat centipedes. So the queens could not actually defend themselves against the centipede, but these large mandibles hang on, they ride them around like a rodeo, and they try to work their stinger in between the segments, and they paralyze the centipede. Now, this large centipede, how do you get it home? Well, you don't. You actually go back home and take your babies to the centipede and have them feed on the ant. We've all seen ants carry food back to the nest, right? These ants in Madagascar don't do that. They bring the food to the kill or to the paralyzed sleeping prey. Now, here's a question for you. If you were an ant and you were hot, thirsty, hungry, been walking all day, and you see this nice, juicy caterpillar, what would you do? Would you hide behind a stone and eat the caterpillar yourself, or would you forego the hunger and just carry it all the way back to the nest to bring to the family? What would you do? Who would eat it themselves? Yeah, you would eat it yourself. All right, an honest one. Well, lucky you're not an ant, because why do ants bring it back to the nest? It's because they can't eat it. In fact, to understand an ant colony, you have to understand it as a super colony, as a super organism. Where's the stomach of an ant colony? It's in the nest. It's their larvae. It's the babies that can eat solid food. So they have to bring the food back, feed it to the babies regurgitate, That means spit it up, and the workers come over and drink it up. Now, workers actually have a stomach, but they just can't get solid food into it. They can only get liquids. In fact, they have two stomachs. They have their social stomach, and they have their own stomach. So when they're licking up that juice, that vomit from the babies, they actually put it in their social stomach, and then those ants walk around distributing food to the other workers and the queen, saying, hey, with their antenna, are you hungry? If they are, they regurgitate that liquid, and they actually feed it to the workers. You can try this at home tonight if you want to.
Maybe not recommended. But, you know, we all have our different ways of living. And you would think that with all of the different documentaries, with all the research that's going on in the world, oftentimes we think, okay, we know everything that's meant to be known. But your research is really showing us that there's a lot of stuff out there that we have no idea about. What would you say is important about your research? What do you think is really finding these new species? What other values of finding them do we have?
Well, I think even myself, who work with ants, I come under this problem humans have. We categorize. We say, oh, this is an ant. Okay, an ant, what's an ant? Well, it's an ant that eats everything, and it's found in my kitchen and stuff, and it's only one type, it's black. Well, even in the field, I pull up an ant and go, I know what this is, and it turns out I don't. Or I have no idea what it does until we actually observe it. And the previous slide actually showed 3 different ants with 3 different mandibles or jaws. They actually eat all different things. The one up here ate pollen. We had no idea it was a pollen specialist. It has little tiny mandibles. It runs over leaves and eats pollen. This ant over here is like a jaguar. It sits behind a leaf and jumps out and grabs whatever it walks past. And this one, we know now, eats centipedes. There are 30,000 ant species in the world, our estimate. And each one has a different way of making a living. Each one has a different own way of feeding itself, its own biology, its own natural history. Now, what's the importance of that role? Well, that's the next step. How does it fit into making a healthy ecosystem? One thing we do know is that if you start removing each of these building blocks and replacing it with maybe an invasive species, trouble begins, because it offsets a cascade of events. That's what we have learned from ecology, is that a system is strong if there are many different components at play. And as we homogenize, reduce to just a few things, the world becomes a much more fragile place.
A little bit like Jenga, if anyone's ever played Jenga. Now, I wonder if there are any questions out there that you might have for Brian. Yeah, over here. What's your question?
Do all ants spray formic acid? Well,
Ooh.
Where do ants come from? Ants evolved from wasps. And like wasps, they all started with a sting. So many ants still have the sting. But you're right, some ants evolved into new chemical warfare. One group uses formic acid, but many other ants have a different chemical that we don't really perceive as dangerous. It's a gump that they turn their spatula into their sting into a spatula, and they just kind of coat the person with it, the ant or anything else that comes up. So there are many ways that ants have used their ability to produce chemicals for defense. In fact, you know, chemicals play an important role in ants. They're like chemical factories. They have words like we have words, but they don't use language like we do. They use language of chemicals. They have pheromones like perfume. Each species has like 10 to 20 different words that they communicate to other individuals in the colony, and they use those words, those chemicals, and they have to hear them. How do they hear them? They use their antenna. And that's why the ant's antenna is in front of their face, so they can better hear and perceive those words, those chemicals.
Oh, very cool. Question over here, yeah. Mm-hmm. Why did the leafcutter ants get the name leafcutter?
Well, they cut leaves. What else would you call them?
Why did they do it? Yeah.
Why do they cut leaves? What a great question. That's a great question. You know what? Actually, being a scientist is very simple. You just have to ask questions, so you're on your way. It all begins with a question. So why do they cut leaves? Well, to figure that out, you can follow them to the nest, and you can do that in the greenhouse over here. We have leafcutter ants, and they take the leaves into the nest to do what? To be farmers. These ants, over 50 million years ago, evolved large-scale farming. There are about 200 species of fungus-growing ants. And the leafcutter ants take the leaves back and feed the fungus. They grow a huge crop of fungus, and they eat the fungus.
Kind of cool.
Even in the Bay Area, there's a fungus-growing ant. Did you know that? I mean, how cool is that? You can drive to Lake Berryessa, where it's easier to find it, and walk out around Lake Berryessa, where all the yahoos are diving into the lake swimming. They're walking on fungus-growing ants.
Wow.
What are they feeding their fungus? That's a reverse question. So you have to go there and find out. Well, I'll give you a hint. There are not enough leaves there for them to grow leaves, to use leaves. I'm just going to tell you, nobody else listen. Do you know what they eat? They eat caterpillar poop. Well, they feed the caterpillar poop to the fungus, and that's the only thing the fungus will eat. And that's what they eat.
Now, speaking of fungus, there is something you have with you. It looks a little like a fungus. What is this prop that you brought with you?
Well, ants are invisible, in part because they live underground, many of them. Now, if you pull over a stone and look at what you see, sometimes you say, wow, there's the nest. Well, actually not. Most ants in the Bay Area in North America have a large subterranean nest, and each ant species has a different structure of their nest, like a tree has a different structure depending on the species. And this is an ant that's called Pogoda myrmex, the seed harvester ant. And this is just to give you an idea of the structure of the nest. These are the chambers, and they go down, 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 maybe 9 feet. And the chambers get bigger and bigger. At the lower chambers, you'll find the queens with the babies and the larvae. And they actually have lots and lots of seeds in these nests. And they're huge nests, and they're permanent, and they build a very specific structure for that species. And what's interesting also is that there's actually behavior related to the depth of the nest. All the babies are way down, and the older you get, the higher you go, and the jobs you take on relate to your age too. In fact, it's only the elders that actually leave the nest to go forage. In a sense, it's because maybe they've already served their time. They can go ahead and take the high-risk job of leaving the nest. But the most important thing to remember is the next time you see an ant on your kitchen counter, it's an elder. So think of that before you
respect the ant.
Respect the elders.
Definitely. All right, do we have any other questions? Yeah, over here.
Well, the question is about, are there any commonality between different ants? And well, one thing we find is that the queen is usually the lowest chamber, one of the lowest chambers. And those that live in the kind of the Arctic regions, their nests are always below, those chambers are always below the permafrost zone. Well, not that deep, but below the frost zone of the soil, so they
not
freeze.
So much the core of the earth.
But ants are interesting in that they do survive very cold conditions. And there are some ants, it's amazing they do this. They survive very extreme cold conditions by actually having the outer layer sacrifice themselves. When they're going to hibernate, in a sense, they form a big ball. And inside's the queen and the younger workers, and on outside the ball are the oldest workers. And they're going to die. They're not going to be alive when spring comes. Crystals will form in their bodies and they'll die. And that stops the crystals from forming inside the other ants. So there's like a layer of ants that sacrifice themselves for the inner ant. And that's how colonies can survive up in the Sierra Nevada, their winters.
They certainly do work together, very social creatures, and it's kind of attests to we have a similar kind of community where we can work together as well and really kind of work towards conserving ourselves and each other and other things that live on this planet as well. And I thank you for doing all this work of really learning and sharing what you're learning about those building blocks that are part of this whole system that we call Earth. Really impressive. Is there anything else that you'd like to share with our group here?
Well, don't forget to wear those glasses. Start seeing the invisible. Start seeing the ants. And may the ants be with you.
Thank you so much for coming, everyone. Thank you, Brian.